All right. Within the last couple of days, Israel has dropped a bomb on Syria so big it hit the Richter scale as if it was an earthquake. We've got President Trump meeting with world leaders all around the world. To help me go through the big stories in the news, I have retired Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Colonel Macgregor, thank you for joining me.
Sure, happy to be here.
So, Trump held a press conference at Mar-a-Lago recently. He was asked if he would preemptively strike Iran's nuclear facilities. Trump said, "Is this a serious question? That's stupid." Do you think that the deep state in Washington, D.C., are they going to try to bait Trump into attacking Iran, or is this just a stupid reporter asking a stupid question?
I don't know that it's an entirely stupid question. I'm glad to know that that's the way the president reacted to it. You know, as far as I'm concerned, preemptive war is essentially what Bismarck called it years ago. He said it's committing suicide out of fear of death. So I oppose preemptive wars, but the Israelis have engaged in that periodically, and frankly, so have we. No, I think what we have going on right now, and in fact, I wrote an article in the American Conservative that came out today that addresses this. It calls Iran America's new war of choice. And basically, I argue that Mr. Netanyahu doesn't have a great deal of time now between today and the inauguration. He's wrestling with what to do next. Contrary to what he said publicly, Hamas is not entirely destroyed. Neither is Hezbollah. But Syria has disintegrated. And this gives him great hope because he now has a corridor through which he can fly strikes into Iran. So my supposition is that he's not going to wait too much longer to attack Iran. Why wait for the possibility that President Trump arrives in office on 20 January and then decides that he's not very enthusiastic about a war with Iran? I mean, right now he's largely promised unconditionally to do whatever the Israelis want, but a war with Iran is not going to be limited to just Iran. That's going to engulf the region. Secondly, he's looking at the Turks. The Turks are building up forces very rapidly for an attack on the Kurds in Syria. What the Kurds have done in northeastern Syria is build effectively an independent Kurdish state, thanks to our help, Israeli help, MI6. And the Israelis are also watching these jihadists as they flood south and take over the territory, at least down to Damascus. So they've moved up to a line just a little south of Damascus. Excuse me. And as you know, Mr. Netanyahu and his cabinet have talked about making Damascus as part of the greater Israel project. In fact, what I would advise everybody in your listening audience to do is go back, find the last address that Mr. Netanyahu gave to the United Nations, in which he held up a map and showed the map of the Middle East, and Jordan was gone, half of Syria was gone, the Sinai and parts of Egypt were gone. They were now all part of greater Israel. And I think that's his long-term strategic goal. He's going to try and accomplish it, as much of it as he can, while he has an obedient administration in Washington with Biden. And I would anticipate continuation of that under President Trump. But you never know with President Trump. He's mercurial. He can change his mind and he can do things differently. So I think that was a loaded question, because I don't think he's going to have the chance to make the decision. I think Mr. Netanyahu will start the war with Iran on the assumption that we will come to their rescue regardless of what happens. And he wants to do this while the Turks are engaged with the Kurds, because it's no secret that the Turks would like to destroy Israel. They're less vocal about it, but they have the military power, particularly the ground force. And Mr. Erdogan has talked about Turkish troops marching into Gaza. And one can say with almost absolute certainty, he would love to march into Jerusalem and posture as the Islamic hero that liberated Jerusalem for the hated Israelis. So you put that together, and you really want to get us involved in the region. You want us to be part of your war if you're Mr. Netanyahu, because the larger picture is not favorable strategically to Israel.
Okay. And Turkey is one of those confusing members of NATO where they're a part of it, but they still want to openly trade with Russia. They still wouldn't mind taking over Israel. And yet, they have a relationship with the United States, but it's somewhat tenuous. Would they set that to the side to further Turkey's agenda?
The Turks have played this. Well, I shouldn't say the Turks. Mr. Erdogan has frequently been on all sides of every issue. And he will publicly say, no, we want good relations with Israel. But we know that in private, Mr. Erdogan is far more Islamist and extreme in his views than he is publicly. Remember, he's the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is, at least in part, the foundation for Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and this conglomeration of jihadists called HTS. I won't even try to pronounce it in Arabic. That influence reaches all the way to Egypt, as well as into Jordan. If you're sitting in Egypt right now and you're watching what's going on, you should be scared as hell, because it's very easy to stage a similar Muslim Brotherhood uprising with Islamist support from elsewhere than it's ever been before. Remember, about a third or more of these so-called jihadists are not even really from the Middle East. Most of them are from Central Asia. Mongolian Turkic Muslims that are quite radical, including a very large contingent of Uyghurs from China. And when we have criticized the Chinese for their harsh treatment of Uyghurs, we always fail to point out that the Uyghurs that they have put into these camps and have under secure guard and surveillance are the Uyghurs that are Muslim extremists. So that's why when the Saudis went to visit China, they had no objections to what the Chinese were doing with the Uyghurs, because they recognized the big difference between the body of the population of Uyghurs and the extremists. So right now, we have this joint Israeli-Turkish hegemony attempt over the entire region. I don't think it'll last. I think it'll break apart. And the Israelis are going to have to face the ugly truth that they now share a border with Turkey. Because even though they may call it something else once they've disposed of the Kurds, what remains there will be a satellite of, or frankly, almost an integral part of Turkey.
What was this bomb that Israel dropped in the last few days? I saw a video of it on Twitter, and it looked massive. And I read that it basically set off the Richter scale 3.0 earthquake. What was that?
Well, to be frank with you, I don't know. We'd have to ask the United States Air Force that supplies most of the munitions to the Israelis and see whether or not they'd give you a truthful answer. But we do have things much larger than a 2,000-pound bomb. And that may have been one of the 9,000-pound bombs. People who've said, no, this is a quote-unquote clean nuclear weapon. Clean nuclear weapons don't exist. The telltale radiation would absolutely be detected. It was not a nuclear weapon, but it certainly looked like one from a distance, or perhaps more accurately, a very large fuel air explosive bomb, which creates this kind of fireball. And I'm sure that's not going down well in Russia right now, which stiffens Russian resolve to stand by Iran, in my judgment.
Okay. What about... So Syria has fallen. Bashar al-Assad has fled to Russia. Does he just live out the rest of his life under Russian protection, or does he get handed over to somebody at some point?
I surmise he will stay there as long as Snowden does. There won't be any difference. But we have to understand that Syria has not been occupied. Syria is gone. It's just disintegrated. It's now a region between Turkey and Israel, and Iraq, that is going to be carved up in various ways. Now, the Israelis would love to transform Syria into little statelets of ethno-pure or religious pure groups, because that's essentially what they're trying to do with themselves by ethnically cleansing the Arabs out of the West Bank as well as Gaza. I don't think that'll happen. It's always been a place that was multi-confessional. Now, they are killing Christians at this point. They're not universally killing Christians everywhere in Syria, but they're killing them. Some areas where the more extreme jihadists live are basically telling the cross worshipers, your time has come. You can go on Telegram and you can look at all the horrific decapitations and murders. I think that's inevitable. Unfortunately, Assad kept the peace between all these various ethnic groups, and he suppressed violently the Sunni Islamist extremists. They, of course, are Mr. Erdogan's allies, and frankly, we've helped to stand them up as well. We've provided funding for them, assistance, training. This goes back to 2011 when Obama signed the order for the CIA to essentially build the plan and execute the plan to dethrone or regime change Syria.
Okay. Is that when he was, is that when Bashar al-Assad was accused of using chemical weapons on his own people?
Yes, and of course we know that was false. He did not do that. That was another false flag managed twice by the so-called white helmets, but they were set up by MI6 in London. The British intelligence agency staged that. Everybody who's looked at it has come away with that conclusion, especially British people or former diplomats, intelligence types, as well as people in the United States. But unfortunately, that lie still, is perpetrated everywhere or disseminated everywhere. Even Trump referred to it, which is sad because it's just not true.
Okay. You mentioned this bomb with Israel. You would have picked up on radioactive stuff. What do you make of these mystery drones over New Jersey? Biden, his administration, the Department of Homeland Security, they're all saying, we have no idea what these are, but don't shoot them down. Trump is saying, of course, the government knows what they are. They wouldn't stand by if they didn't. I'm also reading that these are like sniffing out radioactive material that has possibly gone missing. What do you know of, if anything?
Well, President Trump is right. The government's not going to shoot anything down that is ostensibly connected to whatever they're doing. So I think it's a DOD matter, a matter for Department of Defense. They do not want to tell you very much about it for whatever reasons. We could sit here and speculate for hours on what those could be, but we don't know. If I knew, I would tell you, but I just don't know. Somebody tried to convince me this was evidence for first contact with aliens. They're here. Okay, fine. I don't know. But one thing is certain: we've closed airspace over numerous areas, and these drones are flying in and out without any interruption, which tells me it's deliberate. And it's DOD sponsored, probably. Although I would be surprised if intelligence elements were not also involved. But the bottom line is, if they were actually alien to us, in other words, from a foreign power, we'd shoot them down. Remember, we shot down this silly weather balloon that everyone insisted was launched as a dangerous intelligence collection device by the evil Chinese, which was all nonsense. Untethered weather balloons are commonplace on this planet. And these, unfortunately, were swept by the direction of the wind across the United States. Then we sent up an F-35, for God's sakes, to shoot it down. So if we wanted to shoot these down because they were dangerous, we would do it. So my assumption is the government's behind it. The government knows. And the government is not very good at lying. It has been better in the past, but I think people like Kirby and others have lied so frequently, so often about so much, they no longer have any credibility, so Americans don't listen.
Yeah. Well, and again, Trump saying they wouldn't allow this if they didn't know, right? Like they're not going to allow 50, 100 drones to interrupt airplane routes and cause hysteria and worry. I mean, again, we don't want to sit and speculate. I just didn't know if maybe you had heard anything or anything like that. So, okay, what was your reaction to this report from the IG saying that the FBI, in fact, had at a minimum 26 paid confidential human sources on the ground on January 6th. Some of them went into the building. Some of them did damage. Many of them were at least provoking people to go towards entering the building. What are your thoughts on that report?
Well, first of all, I don't have any personal knowledge of anything that happened on 6th January. I was nowhere near it. At the time, I was in the Pentagon, and I was never invited to any special meetings about 6th January. So I'm totally remote from it. My suspicion is that's probably accurate, and we shouldn't be surprised by that. The FBI infiltrates large numbers of groups. Anything that they suspect could be a threat. Now, I think they've gone overboard under Director Wray, who is part of the cabal, along with Mayorkas and the Attorney General and others. They're all part of this cabal that's trying to create the illusion that people like you and me are the enemy of America. We're the evil ones because we're white and we're Christians. And as a result, we're dangerous because with that comes the evil word nationalism. Well, I am a nationalist, an American nationalist. I don't know of anybody who served for any long term in the United States Armed Forces who is not a nationalist. We by nature are nationalists. That's why we joined. We believe in the country. We're prepared to fight for it. But this is the sort of upside down world that the Biden administration has created. And I think they're going to try and maintain that fiction up until the last day they are in power. And I sincerely hope that President Trump simply grants amnesty to the vast majority of these people. Now, there may be some in that prison right now, believe it or not, who may actually be FBI informants. That sounds strange, but I think it's possible. We might want to look into that because that's not the first time we've done that in order to provide cover for future operations. But on the whole, I think 98% of those people are not very different from us, normal Americans who believe in the country, and they went there and they're being set up for something that really they didn't do. But this is not news. It's just that the mainstream media refuses to concede it. Go back to your missile strikes against the alleged evil chemical weapons used by Saddam, or not Saddam, but Assad. That was wrong. That didn't happen. That was a hoax. Ted Postel came out and said it. A whole host of British experts said it. But no one will go back and retract. One thing we never do in Washington is retract lies. Has anybody stood up and ultimately retracted the whole Russia hoax with President Trump during his first term? No. Who are the people that are responsible for that? They should be in jail.
Yeah.
But then you'd have to look into most of the mainstream media since they were co-conspirators, right?
Yeah. I was shocked that Trump actually won a lawsuit against George Stephanopoulos and ABC because, all of his other ones, they've been dismissed. Oh, you're a celebrity. Oh, you're a public figure. I was shocked to see him actually win one of those. Okay, going back to President Trump at this same Mar-a-Lago press conference, he was asked if Xi Jinping of China would be coming to his presidential inauguration. Trump said, "I don't know, but look forward to working with him." He then said Xi and himself get along well, which is good for America. He then said, if America and China work together, they can solve most of the world's problems. Is this Trump being diplomatic? Is this Trump thinking like a businessman? Is this Trump being aware of the fact that it's better to compliment people you're competing with versus criticizing foreign leaders? What are your thoughts on that?
King George V, William II of Germany, King George V of Great Britain, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were all, I think, second or third cousins. They grew up together. They knew each other. None of them wanted the First World War. I mean that. None of them really wanted it. What happened? We got the First World War. So however good you may have in terms of relations with a foreign leader, it's not very significant. I think President Trump has a habit because he sees this as a critical component of his business experience. Well, that may work in business, but in the hardball world of international relations, interests are what drive everything. If your interests coincide, well, then you have common ground. You can forge whatever economic or political or cultural ties you want. But if your interests do not coincide, you may come into conflict. And that the challenge then is to find those areas where there's not agreement and avoid them. That's what intelligent people do. We haven't been very intelligent over the last 50 years. In fact, we've cultivated these conflicts. I think we've cultivated crisis and conflict with Russia far too long. It's catastrophic now. And I think we've done the same thing with the Chinese. That doesn't mean we agree on everything, but there's no real rationale for an armed conflict. So I know President Trump likes to say that. I don't think it makes any damn difference.
Okay. Could it be, though, that because I think he's still going to try and use his tariffs on China, the ones that he got in place before that Biden kept, he's going to probably keep those. Could it be that he is hoping to maybe go through the back door, the Chinese back door, in order to get to Putin, in order to end the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, I think there are very, what I would call unenlightened or small-minded people around President Trump who believe in that. That's foolish and stupid. There will be no daylight between Beijing and Moscow. There's no reason for daylight. They are in a very mutually beneficial relationship. Everything Russia has, China needs. And what China produces, Russia needs. So you can ship all of your natural resources, mineral wealth, other things periodically to China. They pay a fair price. The Chinese have not tried to gouge the Russians in any way. And the Chinese are producing consumer goods now that compare very favorably with those things produced in the United States and Europe. And so the Russians are happy to buy them. It just doesn't make sense for conflict to exist between China and Russia. The Chinese do not want to live in lower Siberia. I know that comes as a shock to everybody in the United States, but they really don't. And if you look at China and where its people lie concentrated, they're all along the coast. You go in the coast maybe 300-400 miles, and the size of that coast is referred to in Asia as the Chinese banana, because that's where the Chinese live. That's where they produce everything. That's where they work. The Chinese like it. They're happy there. Now, they do move into other countries, and they frequently get into a lot of trouble because they do not assimilate. They're very tribal. They establish colonies, and then they work hard together as a group to gain more and more wealth until they take over the economy. Then the Chinese are thrown out of the country. They've been thrown out of Vietnam, thrown out of Indonesia, tossed out of Malaysia. The Chinese are not wanted because of their tribalism and the obvious connection back to the motherland. And the Chinese more recently had a problem in Vietnam. It got to the point a few years ago where the Vietnamese burned down Chinese factories and were attacking Chinese citizens. So everyone in the Pentagon expected a war to break out between Vietnam and China. The Chinese would strike back. No, not at all. The Chinese sent ships and planes to gather their people and bring them home. And the Vietnamese and the Chinese settled their differences in the South China Sea at that point over oil drilling platforms without going to war. Then they established a hotline between Ho Chi Minh City and Beijing so that if anything serious came up, they could contact each other immediately. Does that sound to you like an aggressive, hostile China that wants to overrun and conquer Asia? They want to do business. And as always, there are pros and cons to doing business with the Chinese. There are pros and cons to doing business with us. I mean, keep in mind, we're always quick to tell somebody, well, we'll do business with you, but we insist on the following standards for human rights, standards for democracy and liberalism, standards for laws and all this kind of business. And most of the time in Africa and Southeast Asia, elsewhere, people say, forget it. You don't understand our country. There's a famous event where an Israeli ambassador went to visit with an Uzbek president. This is just a few years ago, and said to the Uzbek president, hello, I'm from Israel. We want good relations, do business. And the president of Uzbekistan said, well, we're happy to have you, but we need to sort some things out right now. I just threw the Turkish ambassador out of my country because he was trying to cultivate radicalism in our mosques. Are you gonna try and do something like that? Because if you try to come in here and undermine my government, I'm going to throw you out of the country. He said, I already put 500 plus Islamist radicals in jail. I executed 50 or 60, and the United States government says I'm a criminal and put me on a sanctions list. Are you going to do that? And of course, the Israeli ambassador said, no, it's quite all right with us if you want to hang these Islamist terrorists and jihadists. We are out of touch with the rest of the world. The rest of the world, the whole world wants to do business with us, but they don't care to be dictated to by us, how they live, how they govern, and what kind of culture they should maintain.
What do you think will happen with this Russia-Ukraine war? I mean, obviously, Zelensky, he's running out of bodies, he's running out of support, he's running out of money, yet he continues to beat the war drum and openly, I guess, not be hostile towards Trump, but just he doesn't want to go along with Trump trying to end this war. What do you think will be the outcome as Trump officially is inaugurated end of January?
A couple of things. I've said this before. This man Zelensky was born in Russia. His first language is Russian. He is not a Ukrainian. So we need to understand that. He had trouble learning Ukrainian. It took him several months to master Ukrainian, which is, if you speak Russian, it shouldn't be that difficult, but it was difficult for him. He's advertised his Jewish connections because I don't know that he's a practicing Jew, but he's of Jewish ancestry. That is being useful to him politically in Ukraine to portray Ukraine as a victim, of course, and to cultivate anti-Russian sentiment. I wouldn't pay any attention to Zelensky. He's a puppet. Now, who are his puppet masters? Well, they're people like Soros. I would even argue someone like Larry Fink, who has great connections back to Zelensky because he's been trying to buy up what remains of Ukraine west of the Dnieper River and repurpose it for whatever he wants in agriculture. You remember this young man, I can't remember his name now. He was accused and then charged and eventually prosecuted for stealing billions of dollars through some sort of scam hedge fund. His parents were at Stanford or something as professors. I can't remember his name, but
Sam
Bankman-Fried. That's
yes,
right.
There we go.
He was connected to Zelensky and to Fink and all these other people. You got to step back from this and see reality. The Ukrainians are intelligent people, but they're very gullible. And I think a lot of Ukrainians, largely because of their memories of the Second World War and what happened in the interwar period, were quite anxious to see the Russians punished or harmed in some way. You got to go back and you have to understand what was done from 1929 to 32, specifically in Ukraine, where at least 6 to 7, maybe 9 million Ukrainians were killed, probably 2 million Russians as a result of an orchestrated famine. That had been done previously by Trotsky and others in the Bolshevik leadership inside Russia in the early 20s, orchestrated famines. In other words, it's cheaper, faster, better to do two things to your political adversaries. One, you can starve them to death. Two, you can deport them to the Arctic Circle, where eventually they just die of the cold up there and the hard work. Then, of course, you can shoot them. But it's cheaper to do the first two things. And that's what Lenin and ultimately Stalin were engaged in. How many people died? Nobody will ever really know with precision because the Russians are horrible at keeping records. But I think somewhere's between 20, 25 million people inside the Soviet Union were killed from the time the Bolsheviks took power in 1919 until 1939. I mean, the first things the Russians did to about 1.5 million Poles who were living in Eastern Poland, when they took the eastern half of the country and the Germans took the western half, they deported all the Poles to labor camps. Most of them died. This is how the Bolsheviks did business. So millions and millions of people have been killed that way. The Ukrainians have never forgotten. They call it the Holodomor, and they're right not to forget it. The problem they've got is to understand that today's Russia is not the same Russia. It's not a communist state. And however many buckets of filth and abuse everybody wants to pour all over Putin's head, he is not Stalin. He's not Lenin. It's not even close. So a part of the problem is this misrepresentation of Russia, which we have reinforced and cultivated. So then you see the resurrection of all these Nazi symbols, which most of the people today don't even understand clearly. And what they stand for is not good, obviously. And then you get this horrible war with the Russians. Now, all this needs to go away. Get rid of Zelensky. And I think the way you get rid of Zelensky, and I have urged this repeatedly to Donald Trump, suspend all military aid to Ukraine. Stop it. 50% of it is stolen anyway. Why do you think Mrs. Zelensky's driving a Bugatti up and down the highway between Poland and Kiev? I mean, perhaps you're wealthy enough to own a Bugatti, in which case my hat's off to you. But in this country, that's not commonplace. And when the president's wife is running around in a Bugatti, you have to raise questions because it doesn't pay very well. So, this guy is a crook and a criminal. He's a fraud. He's someone else's puppet. When you cut that military aid off, he's gone. Because without the tremendous infusions of cash from the United States, how do you pay off the bureaucrats? How do you pay off the senior level of the Army? They're, in fact, paying officers all the way down to lieutenant colonel. The whole place is graft. The whole place is corruption. So that's what needs to stop. The second thing is we need to get out. What are Americans doing in eastern Ukraine? If somebody thinks, we're here to help these Ukrainian Democrats to resist these evil communists, it's a lot of nonsense. That's crap. It's wrong. And the Russians are not committing atrocities against the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainian government is, and its military has frequently, especially if you decide you don't want to fight. So I'm not saying Russia is this utopian society and the most perfect country in the world. They have problems. We have problems, as we well know, that we don't even talk about, obviously. But Ukraine is a disaster. And unless we do these things, get our people out and suspend that aid, this will go on. As soon as we suspend the aid and pull our people out, what do you think the Europeans are going to do? They're going to meet with the Russians and come to a conclusion, end this thing, which is in everybody's interest, most of all in the interest of the Ukrainian people. That state is almost dead. We had a state of almost 40 million. We think there might be 18 million left. We don't know.
Yeah. Wow. It has been decimated. I agree. If they pull that money, I mean, that's a powerful stick and a powerful carrot. And they need to use that to their advantage. Final question. I appreciate you coming on. What are your thoughts on Elon Musk put out a tweet? I can't remember if it was his own account or from Doge, but he basically said, we need to quit giving Lockheed Martin all this money for F-35 fighter jets that don't work. The future of war is drone warfare. What do you think about his comments?
Well, I think he's half right. The future of warfare is not here yet, but it's developing. And unmanned aircraft, unmanned submersibles, unmanned any number of things in the sea and in the air, as well as in space, are going to replace humans in most cases, but not entirely. And we don't know what that means yet. We know that in general, yes, but what the exact trade-offs are is unclear. We've struggled with this for years. Artificial intelligence does not equal human intelligence. It does many things better than a human mind can do, but it doesn't reason the same way. It's all about curve-fitting algorithms. I mean, I don't want to waste everybody's time here, but it's more complex than we can deal with in this short session. But I think he's on to something else, which is why do we subsidize these, frankly, government-sponsored corporations, and they produce something that's not of any value. Well, there are two reasons. First of all, there's no oversight by the civilians who control the Department of Defense. Secondly, you've got a lot of people on the Hill, in the Senate, in the House, who make a lot of money as a result of pushing bad programs. And it's not that they know they're bad and push them. They don't in many cases. I mean, I've sat with members of the Senate and the House Armed Services Committee, and they'll I want to give the military whatever it needs for the military to be good. Well, who can argue with that? Well, what if you're not giving the military what it needs? What if you're giving the military something it says it wants but shouldn't have? The other problem is you've got people at the top of the military that are busy cultivating future jobs outside of the military when they retire. Too many of them are involved with that. So you have a need for change in the way we manage our human capital, change in the way we structure and organize our armed forces, change in terms of strategy. Because if you read something from the government that is allegedly about strategy, what it says is, well, Russia's dangerous, China's the new big enemy, but then there's Iran, there's North Korea, and they all have satellites and supporters in the following various states in the Western Hemisphere as well as the Eastern Hemisphere. And new dangers are emerging in Congo. We see Islamists there. So, okay. The world is full of threats, but the world isn't full of threats. 90% of what passes for threats doesn't make a damn bit of difference to us. No one is interested in pouring money into defense of the United States. Well, what about the borders? What about our littoral waters? What about our ports and harbors? What about our airports? Shouldn't we take care of those? Shouldn't they be secure? And frankly speaking, it doesn't make any difference to us how many Islamists may be in Chad or the Congo Republic or anywhere else. They'll come and go. In fact, you've always had various forms of Islamists inside the Islamic world, just as we have had, at least until recent years, in many cases, radical Christians with radical ideas. Religions breed this sort of thing. Government failures reinforce it. We can't fix all of that, but we can certainly defend ourselves here at home against it and stop intervening in countries where, frankly, we have at best marginal interest. And right now, I listen to everything. Well, we took the oil in northeast Syria. Well, that's a puddle compared with what we own. It's a puddle compared with what else we can get from other places. So why are we holding on to it? That's not a reason to be there. The reason to be there is because we've decided we want to protect Israel. And we have Kurdish clients. Remember that Erdogan opposed us in 91. And not he, but his government said at that point, don't go into Iraq. Don't turn this place into a hellhole that'll breed Kurdish nationalists and Islamist terrorists and everything else. The Turks don't need this. We don't want it. Well, when we went back in 2003, after we bombed everybody into the Stone Age in Iraq and said we have to go in and defeat this great threat that's building nuclear weapons, the Turks said, don't do this. If you go in there, you're going to end up fragmenting Iraq. The Kurds up north are going to break away. That's going to be a huge problem for us. We're going to end up having a fight there. And what are you doing about all these Shiites? Don't you realize Iran is going to take over Iraq? We Turks are Sunni. We don't like that. All of these things have effectively happened, right? And so now we see this very fragile peace between Israel and Turkey. And the Turks would love to get rid of the Israelis. They hate the Israelis because they are absolutely beyond ferocious anger at what has happened in Gaza and what's going on in the Western Bank. So there's no love lost there. But the Israelis are picking up what they call a security zone in southern Syria. They're picking up new areas they think they can colonize. There's some talk about going into Damascus, which is very dangerous. The Turks are on their own agenda. Their agenda is destroy the Kurdish threat. They don't particularly want a war with Iran, but they would like to destroy the Kurds on their border. They would like to regain control of territory in northern Iraq, which they held for hundreds of years. Kurdish generals routinely would tell American generals, like Abizaid and others, they would point to Kirkuk, which sits in the middle of this oil jugular, and they would say, Kirkuk is a Turkish city. And we would say, nah, it's part of Iraq. It is a Turkish city. How long have the Turks been fighting in the area? And 1,000 years, 800 years? And we're telling them what is or isn't theirs? And how long have we been there? Who are we kidding? We're out of touch with reality. These things are going to come apart. And let me just add one thing here. A few days ago, the Turkish chief of intelligence flew into Damascus for talks with his jihadist allies, no doubt. I don't know who else. He gets off the plane and he goes immediately to the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. Americans don't know anything about the Middle East. They don't know anything about its history. They don't know anything about its people. The Umayyad Mosque, the Umayyad Caliphate existed between roughly 850 and 940, somewhere in there. And this is a beautiful mosque, but it is a monument to that caliphate. And that, of course, is very important to the Turks. Remember, the Turks ultimately, the Turkish Sultan became the Caliph of Islam in the Sunni world. He went there and he prayed. Then he went and met with the jihadists. Now that sent a signal to everybody in the region who knows anything about their history and their religion. And the message was, the empire is back. And that empire is the Turkish Empire that ruled there for hundreds of years. Remember, you watch the silly movies that we watch about the Middle East. They talk about Salah ad-Din, who was actually a Kurd, but he led the Seljuk Turks. And what was his capital other than Cairo? It was Damascus. So, we need to tread carefully. We've unleashed chaos in the Middle East now. We have behaved and we have encouraged the Israelis to behave like arsonists. Go around and light fires. The Israelis want to destroy all of their enemies, which encompasses much of the population that lives around them. So they've just lit fires everywhere they could. Now the fires are burning out of control. And we haven't even had the war with Iran yet, which is coming, because that's step number 2 for Netanyahu. He's got to go after Iran before the Russians finish up in Ukraine and the Turks finish up with the Kurds. While the Turks and the Russians are busy, he wants to go after Iran, which he thinks he can bully into submission. But if he can't, he's going to call on us to help him and rescue him, and then we'll do the job for him. And once you destroy Iran, that only leaves Turkey.
Wow. We've always got our nose in someone else's business, or an ally is putting their nose, knowing that we'll follow them, right into the battle zone. Colonel Macgregor, I want to thank you for coming on. I know there's a lot going on, Russia and North Korea and Ukraine and Israel and the Middle East. It's a lot. I appreciate you keeping up on all of it.
And never forget, our borders are open. These Venezuelan gangs are everywhere now. They're finding their way to affluent neighborhoods. They're a threat to everyone. And they're the tip of the proverbial iceberg. And we're losing 120,000 people a year to fentanyl, which comes up largely from Mexico. So I wish you Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And I pray for fundamental change in the future.
Yeah, me too. Amen. Merry Christmas. Thank you so much for coming on.